Hello there, and welcome back to the Dozing Scholar. Tonight, we will be diving into the surprisingly rich history of soap and exploring how one of the most ordinary objects in your home has traveled through nearly 5,000 years of human civilization. Whether you're here to relax, to drift off to sleep, or simply to learn something new in the quiet of the evening, I hope this story carries you gently through the night. Now, let us begin. Long before soap as we know it existed, people found ways to clean themselves. They used ash and sand and oil. They stood in rivers and rubbed their skin with clay from the banks of slow-moving water. Cleanliness, in some form, has always mattered to human beings. The desire to wash, to feel fresh, to begin again, is older than almost anything we would recognize as civilization. It is one of the quieter threads that runs through the entire human story, present in every culture, on every continent, in every era we have records of. The oldest confirmed evidence of soap making comes from ancient Babylon, in the region we now call southern Iraq, where clay cylinders dating back to around 2800 BCE were unearthed, bearing inscriptions that described a process of boiling fats with ashes. The resulting substance was used primarily for washing wool, preparing fibers for the work of weaving rather than for cleaning the human body. But the chemistry was already there. The fundamental reaction between fat and alkali that underlies every bar of soap ever made was first understood, in practical, if not theoretical terms, in Mesopotamia nearly 5,000 years ago. A later Sumerian clay tablet, dating to around 2200 BCE, goes further. It records a formula consisting of water, alkali derived from wood ash, and cassia oil, a fragrant oil pressed from the bark of a tree related to cinnamon. This is not simply a description of cleaning. It is a recipe, a set of deliberate instructions for producing a specific substance with a specific purpose. It is, as some historians of chemistry have pointed out, one of the earliest recorded chemical reactions in human history. The first soap makers were also, in a quiet way, the first chemists. We do not know who first discovered it. The most compelling theory is that it was an accident. Perhaps someone noticed that the residue left near a fire where fat had dripped into ash had a strange, slippery quality, that it could lift grease from cloth and dirt from skin in a way that water alone could not. The discovery may have happened many times in many places before anyone thought to write it down. That is how a great deal of important knowledge begins, not with intention but with a moment of noticing, with someone paying attention to something that everyone else had walked past. By around 1500 BCE, the Egyptians had refined the process considerably. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest and most detailed medical documents to survive from the ancient world, describes preparations combining animal and vegetable oils with alkaline salts, used both for bathing and for treating skin conditions. Egyptian soap was gentler than its Mesopotamian predecessor, and it carried a social and spiritual dimension that went beyond the merely practical. Priests, whose ritual purity was a matter of religious obligation rather than personal preference, washed regularly and carefully as part of their daily duties. Soap in Egypt was not simply about cleanliness of the body, it was about cleanliness of the self. The two were understood in Egyptian religious thought as deeply connected. The Phoenicians, the great maritime trading people of the ancient Mediterranean, were making soap from goat tallow and wood ash as early as 600 BCE, and they carried knowledge of the process along their trade routes to the peoples they encountered. The ancient Hebrews incorporated ritual washing into religious law, with specific requirements for washing hands before meals and before entering sacred spaces. A rabbinical saying from the period states that physical cleanliness leads to spiritual purity. The connection between washing and virtue, between the clean body and the clean soul, was not a Victorian invention. It is as old as recorded religion. Picture what early soap making would have looked like beside a river at dusk. A fire burning low, the air thick with wood smoke. Animal fat rendered in a clay pot over the heat, its smell rich and heavy. Ash leached with water to draw out the alkali, the liquid slow and slightly cloudy. The two combined and stirred, gradually thickening and changing in texture as the reaction took hold. The smell of early soap would not have been pleasant by modern standards. The raw fats, the sharp bite of the ash lye, the heat of the process, all of it would have produced something pungent and rough. But it worked. And for the people who made and used it, it represented a small but genuine improvement in the quality of daily life. Something that made the morning feel a little less heavy. Something that made the skin feel a little more human. The Romans were obsessed with cleanliness in a way that feels surprisingly modern. Their public bathhouses, known as thermae, were not simply places to wash. They were the social centers of Roman life, the places where the business of the day was discussed, where friendships were maintained, where news moved from one part of the city to another, and where the boundary between private and public life dissolved, at least temporarily, in warm and scented steam. A visit to the thermae followed a deliberate and well-established sequence. You entered first through the apoditerium, the changing room, where you undressed and left your belongings under the watchful eye of an attendant. From there, you might spend time in the palestra, the open exercise courtyard, wrestling or throwing a discus or simply walking before the bathing proper began. Then came the tepidarium, a warm and gently heated room designed to ease the body into what followed. Then the caldarium, the hot room, where the air was thick and humid and the temperature high enough to produce a deep and cleansing sweat. Some thermae also featured the laconicum, a dry heat room, and the sudatorium, a moist steam bath where the heat was even more intense. And then, after all of that, the bracing plunge into the frigidarium, the cold pool, which closed the pores and refreshed the body before the bather dressed and returned to the city. The entire experience could take hours, and that was rather the point. The thermae were not somewhere you went in a hurry. They were somewhere you went to slow down, to talk, to be a citizen rather than simply a worker or a merchant or a soldier. Entry was cheap, often just a single small coin, and on certain days it was free entirely, paid for by a wealthy patron seeking public goodwill. Soldiers, senators, merchants, and slaves could all be found within the same steam-filled walls. The largest bathhouses in Rome, the baths of Caracalla, built in the 3rd century of the Common Era, could accommodate up to 3,000 bathers at once. They contained libraries, gardens, shops, and spaces for massage and perfuming. They were less a bathhouse and more a small city, devoted to the idea that cleanliness and leisure and sociability were things that every citizen deserved. And yet, curiously, the Romans were slow to embrace soap for personal bathing. For much of their history, they preferred to clean their skin using olive oil and a small curved metal scraping tool called a strigil. Oil was applied generously to the body, the dirt and dead skin mixed with it, and then the whole mixture was scraped away with the strigil's curved blade. It was effective, if somewhat labor-intensive, and it left the skin soft and lightly scented. The strigil was a personal possession, carried to the baths the way a modern person might carry a towel. To have your strigil stolen was considered a genuine indignity, and Roman writers made jokes about strigil thieves, with the weary familiarity of people describing a well-known social nuisance. Soap existed in the Roman world, but it was used primarily for laundry and for treating certain skin conditions. The Roman author Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, noted that the finest soap of his time came from the Germanic tribes and the Gauls, who mixed animal fat with wood ash to create a substance used on both the body and the hair. He described it with something close to ethnographic curiosity, as an interesting product of the northern peoples rather than something central to Roman daily life. The word the Romans used for it, sapo, was borrowed from the Germanic languages, a small linguistic fossil that preserves the memory of where the knowledge came from. When the city of Pompeii was buried by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE and excavated centuries later, archaeologists found among its frozen streets a workshop that appears to have been engaged in soap making. Vats and equipment consistent with the saponification process, the chemical transformation of fat into soap, were identified within a structure that had clearly been a working commercial premises. It is a small detail, but a vivid one. Pompeii, a city frozen in a single afternoon, had its soap makers. People who got up that morning and went to work, heating their vats and tending their fires, entirely unaware that the day would be the last the city would ever see. Ordinary daily life, right up until the moment it was not. As the Roman Empire declined and its great infrastructure fell into disuse, the elaborate bathhouse culture that had defined urban life for centuries gradually faded. The lead pipes that carried heated water crumbled. The systems of underfloor heating fell apart. The social fabric that had sustained the therme as institutions frayed and unraveled, and the soap trade moved on, finding new homes and new traditions in the world that came after Rome. The Middle Ages have something of an unfair reputation for dirt. The popular image of medieval people as unwashed, uninterested in cleanliness, and generally unkempt is one that historians have spent considerable effort correcting. The reality is considerably more interesting and considerably cleaner than that image suggests. Medieval people bathed. Public bathhouses existed in medieval cities across Europe, and the records of civic authorities show that they were used regularly. Household accounts from noble and merchant families include regular purchases of soap. Medieval medical texts emphasized the importance of washing for good health, and religious obligations around ritual cleanliness meant that washing was embedded in the rhythms of daily life. The monk Richard of Devizes, writing around 1200 CE, mentioned Bristol as a city so full of soap makers that it was essentially defined by the smell of the trade. That is not the description of a culture that had forgotten how to wash. Soap making in medieval Europe continued in two distinct settings. In monasteries, monks developed their own recipes using whatever local materials were available, rendering the fat of the animals they kept and leaching ash from the wood they burned to produce lye. Monastic soap was functional and practical, made for the needs of the community rather than for trade. It would have been soft and dark, closer to a thick paste than to a bar, and its smell would have varied considerably depending on the fats and ashes available in a particular region and season. By the 9th century, the profession of soap maker was specifically listed in Charlemagne's Capitulare de Villis, an administrative document that catalogued the various trades and skills considered essential to a well-functioning estate. Soap making had, by that point, become recognized as a craft worth naming and preserving. Outside the monasteries, the craft of soap making was becoming increasingly organized and commercially significant. By the 7th century, Italian soap makers had formed guilds. By the 13th century, the cities of Marseille in southern France and the Castile region of Spain had become famous for the quality of their soap. Marseille produced its soap from the abundant olive oil of the Mediterranean, and the resulting product was pale, hard, and gentle on the skin in a way that ash-based soaps made from animal fat were not. Castile soap, named for the Spanish region, was similarly pure, made exclusively from olive oil without the addition of animal fats, and it found its way along trade routes into England and Northern Europe, where it was considered a refined and desirable product. The phrase Castile soap survives in use today, still describing pure olive oil soap, still carrying the name of the Spanish region that first made it famous nearly 800 years ago. In the Islamic world during this same period, the art of soap making had advanced considerably further. The hammam, the Islamic public bathhouse, had become a central institution of urban life across the Middle East and North Africa, maintaining the tradition of communal bathing that Rome had abandoned and elevating it into something with its own distinct rituals and social significance. Personal cleanliness was not merely a practical matter in Islamic culture, but a religious one, with specific requirements for ritual purification woven into the fabric of daily devotional practice. The city of Aleppo, in what is now Syria, was producing a soap of remarkable quality, made from a combination of olive oil and the oil pressed from the berries of the laurel tree. Aleppo soap was hard and long-lasting, and it underwent a curing process of extraordinary patience. After being made and cut, the bars were stored for a minimum of 1 year, and sometimes for several years, in cool stone warehouses. During that time, the outer surface of each bar turned from bright green to a deep, dark brown, while the interior remained a warm olive color. The longer the soap was cured, the gentler and more refined it became. It carried a distinctive, earthy, slightly woody, resinous scent from the laurel oil, something between forest and spice, and it was gentle enough to use on the skin, the hair, and even the face. It found its way along trade routes into the palaces and hammams of the medieval Islamic world, and it was said that the Crusaders, returning from the Holy Land, brought it back to Europe, where it became fashionable among those who could afford it. Aleppo soap is still made today in the same city, using methods that have barely changed in 1,000 years. It is one of the oldest continuously produced commercial products in the world. By the 13th century, Islamic soap making had effectively become industrialized. The cities of Nablus, Fes, Damascus, and Aleppo were all producing hard soap on a commercial scale, with established supply chains, quality standards, and export networks. The knowledge that had traveled from Mesopotamia through Egypt and into the Islamic world had been refined over millennia into something very close to the soap we recognize today. Europe was only beginning to catch up. By the time of the Renaissance, soap had become a matter of commerce, politics, and national pride. Certain cities had built their reputations on the quality of their soap, and that reputation was worth protecting. In Marseille, the soap industry had grown so significant that in 1688, the French government, under the influence of the minister Colbert, issued a decree specifying, with legal force, exactly how Marseille soap must be made. Only pure olive oil of specific quality, no animal fat, no cheaper vegetable oils, no adulterants of any kind. Any soap made in the region of Marseille that did not meet these standards could not legally be called Marseille soap. It was an early and surprisingly modern act of product protection, a legally enforced quality standard applied to a regional product. The kind of regulation we might today associate with champagne or Parmesan cheese was, in the 17th century, being applied to soap. The soap makers of Marseille took the decree seriously. The distinctive green or white cubes of Marseille soap, made to a strict formula and stamped with the weight and place of origin, became a trusted and widely traded product across Europe. Merchants who bought Marseille soap knew exactly what they were getting, and that certainty was itself a form of value. Quality, reliably delivered, was something people would pay for. It is a principle that has not changed. In England, the story of soap took a very different turn. Rather than protecting the quality of the product, the English government chose to tax it. The soap tax, introduced under Queen Anne in 1712, transformed soap from a relatively ordinary commodity into a luxury that ordinary families could barely afford. The tax varied between 1 penny and 3 pence per pound, with the higher rate equivalent to the entire cost of producing the soap in the first place. The price of even the most basic soap tripled almost overnight. The enforcement of the soap tax was thorough and, by modern standards, quite extraordinary. Soap manufacturing was restricted to licensed premises, and all soap pans and boiling vats were required to be fitted with padlocks. The key to those padlocks was held not by the soap maker, but by the excise officer, the government's tax collector, who had to be present at every boiling. 12 hours' notice was required before any soap could be legally produced. The soap maker could not simply decide to make soap when demand required it. They had to schedule it, notify the authorities, and wait for the taxman to arrive with his key before the fires could be lit. The minimum permitted batch was 1 imperial ton, meaning that small-scale production was effectively made illegal. Soap making had to be industrial to be legal. The tax endured for a remarkable 140 years. For 5 generations of English families, soap was a rationed luxury. Soap smuggling became widespread as ordinary people found ways around the tax, and many large-scale manufacturers relocated to Ireland, where no equivalent tax existed. Washing clothes was an occasional rather than a regular activity for the poor. Bathing the body was a privilege of the wealthier classes. In some households, a single bar of soap was kept under lock and storage, brought out for particular occasions, and then put away again. The soap tax did not only affect cleanliness, it affected health in ways that the doctors and scientists of the time were only just beginning to understand. It is one of the stranger ironies of history that a government which taxed soap for 140 years was also, in the same period, deeply concerned about the health of its population. The two things seem contradictory, but the history of public health is full of such contradictions, of policies designed for revenue that had consequences no one intended, and of improvements that arrived not through planning, but through the eventual removal of obstacles that should never have been there in the first place. The repeal of the British soap tax in 1853 changed everything. Almost overnight, soap became affordable, and what had been a luxury for a century and a half became, within a generation, a household staple, as ordinary and unremarkable as bread. The timing was not coincidental. The Victorian era was being reshaped by a new and frightening understanding of disease. Cholera had swept through London in repeated and devastating waves, killing thousands of people in a matter of weeks, in outbreaks that seemed to strike without pattern or warning. In 1854, a doctor named John Snow mapped the cases of a cholera outbreak in the Soho district of London and identified a single contaminated water pump in Broad Street as the source. It is one of the founding moments of modern epidemiology, and it began to shift public understanding of how disease moved through a city. The connection between contaminated water, poor sanitation, and infectious illness was becoming impossible to ignore. Joseph Basil Gett, a civil engineer of remarkable vision and ambition, responded by designing a vast new sewer system beneath London, one of the great engineering achievements of the Victorian age, which transformed the health of the city within a generation. And Joseph Lister, working in Glasgow in the 1860s, demonstrated that cleaning hands and surgical instruments before operating on a patient dramatically reduced the rate of fatal infection. Cleanliness, science was revealing with increasing urgency, was not a luxury or a nicety. It was, quite literally, a matter of life and death. Soap manufacturers understood this moment precisely. The convergence of affordability, scientific endorsement, and a Victorian cultural obsession with respectability and moral virtue created conditions for the soap industry unlike anything that had existed before. Cleanliness became associated not just with health but with character. To be clean was to be respectable. To be respectable was to be virtuous. And to be virtuous in the anxious moral landscape of Victorian England was everything. Soap was no longer simply a cleaning product, it was a symbol. Into this moment came William Lever. Born in Bolton in 1851, the son of a grocer, Lever had an instinct for business and an understanding of ordinary people that proved remarkable. In 1884, he launched a soap he called Sunlight, made from a blend of vegetable oils rather than the tallow that most soaps of the period used, and wrapped in a distinctive branded package at a time when most soap was sold unbranded, cut from large blocks. He gave his soap a name and a face and a promise, and that combination proved transformative. Lever marketed Sunlight with the simple message that it would lighten the labor of the household and free ordinary women from the heaviest and most time-consuming of domestic burdens. His factory on the Mersey grew rapidly, and alongside it, he built something extraordinary. Port Sunlight was a model village constructed for the workers of Lever's factory. It had housing, schools, a church, medical care, art galleries, and green public spaces. Lever believed that the people who made his soap deserved to live in conditions that reflected the values his soap was supposed to represent. The village was idealistic, and it was paternalistic in ways that modern eyes recognize as complicated. The workers did not own their homes and were expected to conduct themselves in ways that Lerver approved of. But as an act of large-scale social imagination, it was genuinely remarkable. Port Sunlight still exists today, a quiet village of ornate arts and crafts houses tucked beside the Mersey, and it remains one of the most unusual monuments to the soap trade that history has produced. And then there was Pears. Andrew Pears had founded his soap company in London in the early 19th century, originally making a transparent soap for the wealthy clients of his barber shop in Soho, where the fashion was for pristine, pale complexions, and where the harsh soaps of the period, some of which contained arsenic or lead, were doing more harm than good. His transparent soap was gentle and refined, and it built a loyal following among the well-to-do. But it was under the management of Thomas Barrett, who married the founder's granddaughter and rose to lead the company, that Pears became something larger. Barrett was described by Lord Northcliffe as the father of English advertising. He paid the socialite Lily Langtry to endorse the soap in 1882, making her one of the first celebrities in history to be paid to promote a commercial product. He had 500,000 French coins stamped with the Pears name and attempted to put them into circulation, generating publicity so enormous that the government was forced to pass a law to stop him. But his most celebrated act came in 1886 when he purchased the copyright to a painting by the artist John Everett Millis for £2,200. The painting showed Millet's young grandson, a golden-haired boy gazing upward at a soap bubble he had just blown through a pipe. Barrett added a bar of Pears soap to the image, reproduced it on a vast scale, and distributed it across Britain. The painting, known ever after as Bubbles, became one of the most recognizable images of the Victorian age. Millet was attacked by the artistic community for allowing his work to be used commercially, accused of degrading art in the service of commerce. The novelist Marie Corelli wrote to him directly, telling him that she considered the Pears posters gross libels on both his work and his character. Millet replied that he had sold the copyright and had no legal power to stop it. His grandson, the boy in the painting, grew up to become an admiral in the Royal Navy and was affectionately known as Bubbles for the rest of his long life. It was one of the first truly modern advertising campaigns, art in the service of commerce, beauty in the service of a bar of soap, and it worked. By the 20th century, soap had become so ordinary that we stopped noticing it. It was simply there, by the sink in the bathroom, on the shelf, a thing you reached for without thinking, used without considering, and replaced when it ran out. The 5,000 years of knowledge and accident and ingenuity and trade and taxation and artistry that had produced it were entirely invisible. New varieties multiplied constantly: beauty soap, medicated soap, deodorant soap, soap promising youth and softness and health. Then, in the 1940s, something arrived that began to quietly displace soap altogether for certain purposes. Synthetic detergents were developed partly in response to wartime shortages of animal fats, and partly because of a practical limitation that had always constrained traditional soap. Soap reacts with the minerals in hard water to form a scummy residue, the familiar grey ring around the bathtub, and it loses much of its cleaning power in the process. Synthetic detergents did not have this problem. They were more stable, more effective in hard water, and worked at lower temperatures, making them better suited to the increasingly mechanical world of household laundry. They were not, technically speaking, soap at all, but a chemically engineered alternative. Detergents took over the washing of clothes. They spread into dishwashing and then into industrial cleaning. Soap retained its place at the bathroom sink, but it had lost ground it would never fully recover. Then, in 1980, a man named Robert Taylor was driving to work one morning and found himself thinking about the bar of soap by his sink. He thought it was messy, slippery, inconvenient in ways that seemed unnecessary. He went home and began experimenting, and he created a liquid soap in a pump bottle that he called soft soap. He understood immediately that if his product succeeded, large corporations would simply copy it. So he did something audacious. He spent $12 million, every penny his small company was worth, purchasing 100 million plastic pump mechanisms from the only two American manufacturers that made them. He created a backorder so enormous that no competitor could obtain pumps for nearly a year. In 6 months, he had sold $25 million worth of soft soap. He sold the brand to Colgate-Palmolive in 1987 and retired. The liquid soap dispenser by your sink today exists because one man stared at a bar of soap one morning and decided there had to be a better way. In the early 2000s, antibacterial soap seemed to be the inevitable next step. Products containing triclosan and similar compounds promised not just to clean the skin, but to kill the bacteria on it, and they spread rapidly through household bathrooms across the world. But the science that followed was not entirely supportive. Concerns were raised that antibacterial soaps were contributing to antibiotic resistance, that the compounds were disrupting hormonal systems in both humans and aquatic life, and that they were no more effective at preventing illness than ordinary soap and water. In 2016, the United States Food and Drug Administration banned triclosan and 18 other antimicrobial compounds from consumer soaps. The antibacterial revolution turned out to be shorter than the companies that drove it had hoped. And yet, something unexpected has been happening alongside all of this. Quietly, and with increasing momentum, the bar of soap has been returning. Artisan soap makers working in small studios and kitchen workshops have been reviving the old methods. Cold processed soap, made from olive oil and shea butter and coconut oil and essential oils, scented with lavender and cedarwood and rosemary, cured on wooden racks for weeks before it is sold. At farmers' markets and craft fairs and small online shops, people are choosing these bars deliberately and often for the same reasons. Less plastic, more natural ingredients, a connection to the craft of making, to the idea that something made carefully and slowly by a person who understood what they were doing is worth something more than something produced by a machine in a factory you will never visit. There is something quietly telling about this return. In an era of extraordinary technological complexity, of products made from materials and processes that most people could not begin to understand, there is a growing appetite for things that are simple and explicable. For a bar of soap made from oils and lye and thyme, whose ingredients you can read and whose process you can, if you choose, learn and carry out yourself. The wheel has not come full circle exactly, but it has turned far enough to look back at the beginning with something like recognition. The ingredients have changed, and the setting has changed, and the person making it is more likely to be in a converted garage than beside a Mesopotamian river. But the fundamental act, fat and alkali combined, the oldest recorded chemical reaction in human history, is the same. The first soap makers would understand it entirely. And so we come to the end of tonight's journey, from the clay tablets of ancient Babylon, where someone pressed the world's first soap recipe into wet clay by firelight, to the market stalls of your nearest town, where someone is selling a bar made by hand using the same fundamental chemistry. We have followed one small, quiet object through nearly 5,000 years of human life. Through Roman bathhouses and medieval monasteries, through the laurel-scented soap markets of Aleppo and the olive groves of Marseille, through locked vats and Victorian factory floors, through tax and trade and artistry and revolution, through the moment a man in Minnesota bought every plastic pump in America and changed what sits beside your sink. And underneath all of that history, the same simple truth that the first soap makers understood by accident beside a fire in ancient Mesopotamia, that to wash is to refresh, that to clean is in some small way to begin again, that the act of washing your hands at the end of a long day is, if you let it be, a small and quiet ceremony, a moment of transition between the day and the rest that follows it. The bar of soap by your sink tonight carries all of that within it, all of those hands and all of those fires, and all of those long, slow centuries of human beings trying to take care of themselves and each other, compressed into something that fits in the palm of your hand. Let that thought rest with you now, as everything else rests. The day is done. The story has been told, and the night is quiet and still and entirely yours. Sleep well.